This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, I'm not entirely sure how this one's going to go, but in the case that you do not see this updated until Monday evening, as opposed to the mid-morning, early afternoon, I apologize in advance. Jury duty did me dirty. Not the kind of mail I enjoy seeing, but, well, I'm doing my due diligence. And we'll just leave the conversation at that. Not gonna lie, did kind of foul up my Monday schedule, and I'm not the kind of guy that likes when my schedule gets toyed with. I am currently recording this on Sunday, and I'll probably have enough time later tonight to edit this and at least try to get everything formatted the way I want it to. Probably not going to have enough time to upload it to either YouTube or Rumble, so we'll see where the chips fall. I might have to do that on Monday, but it will be way later in the afternoon. Luckily, this weekend wasn't too cluttered with wrestling, so we have that going for it. I'm not going to spend too much time BSing with the intros here. I'm going to sort of launch directly into the reviews and try to get this one on the short side because, like I mentioned last week, my schedule is going to be a little busy over the next couple weeks. And, you know, these two shows didn't have a whole lot going in terms of major news bulletins or anything. SmackDown was a little better than normal, but I think that was an anomaly more than anything. Retro Raw was, well, it was a show. The final segment was a real barn burner, but I am still counting my blessings while I can. The fact that these shows are still only about 45 minutes in runtime, because in a few years when they go to 2 hours, I don't even want to imagine how much of a chore these shows are going to be to get through. Maybe reliving some of the Attitude Era will change my perception somewhat. Maybe. Maybe not. It depends on how much the show is dedicated to the Steve Austin Vince McMahon story and how much of Russo's booking dominates the program. That's going to be the tough part to navigate as we try to balance out the good stuff and the bad stuff during that period. For every good segment where Austin went out there and stunned Vince in front of the world, there was also Boss Man cooking up Al Snow's dog and feeding it to him in the hotel room. Or Kai and Ty running around acting like 9-year-old goofballs. Can't wait for the choppy your pee-pee skits. Yeah, those will be a breath of fresh air. Maybe it'll be like the Dynamite reviews, where the shows are just so painfully bad, we'll just have fun ripping them to shreds every week. Could be a good time. But we're still a few years out from those episodes. So instead, why don't we get going with this May 16th, 1994 episode of Raw, which was still not very good, but, I mean, again, it was only an hour. And I've been sulking over this one. When I looked at the caption for this week's Retro Raw, and I saw Earthquake and Yokozuna standing across the ring from each other in sumo gear, I was like, fuck. Yeah, we got to review this thing, don't we? I mean, we don't have to, but it was sort of the featured segment on this week's show. So I would be doing it a grave disservice if we didn't cover it. Vince was sure excited by it. Anyone surprised?
Oh yeah, pal.
Earthquake versus Yokozuna in a sumo fight. Two big meaty behemoths locking horns in diapers. That's such good shit. Hell, it was something. I will give it that. Vince McMahon loved himself some big men bouts. His wet dream come to life. If only the Bodybuilding Federation took off. But before we get there, we had some other horrors to cover on this program. Take the opening match as an example. It is Bam Bam Bigelow versus Thurman Plug. But his friends call him Sparky. I call it a rotten gimmick, but Sparky works too. Still referring to him as Thurman Plug as well, as opposed to Bob Holly. I forget how long the Thurman thing lasted. Not that long from what I remember, but we're still in the early periods. You talk about the list of names that have been forever vanquished from the English language. Does anybody ever come across a Thurman in your free time? Is anyone actually friends with a guy named Thurman? If so, I apologize. Both for you and the guy named Thurman. And he's still coming out in that hideously foul ring gear, too. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that this match was also a King of the Ring qualifier. The same King of the Ring tournament in '94 that also featured names such as Razor Ramon and Owen Hart. And here in the Raw opener, we get Sparky Plug in a qualifying match. Times were rough. What can I say? Not to say it was hideously awful or anything. Bob Holly was never a bad wrestler. Like, he wasn't remarkable in the ring or anything. Like, he knew how to do all the basics. But watching him do it in a neon green jumpsuit... like, how do you take anything he does seriously? I mean, it's not visually appealing. You also listening to Macho Man and Vince continually refer to him as Sparky. That didn't help his cause any. Especially with the way Vince said it. It always sounded like he was speaking to a dog. I mean, what the guys did was fine. I mean, Bam Bam could have a good match with a broom. I mean, he was always solid in the ring. They did some basic spots early on. Simple. Bam Bam cut him off for the heat. They had Holly make a comeback toward the finish. Hit some big high offense stuff on Bam Bam for a couple near falls. And after he tried hitting the ropes for a series of clotheslines, Luda Vachon grabbed at his foot and tripped him up. And from there, Bam Bam decked Sparky with a lariat. Then he did a big diving splash over the top rope for the 3 count. You know, once you get over the sheer lunacy of the Spark Thurman Plug gimmick, the wrestling was all right. Didn't get a whole lot of time. But all of that led over to Todd Pettingill's King of the Ring card update. In addition to the updated brackets, we also got the official announcement of Diesel versus Bret Hart for the WWF Championship, which may have been the only featured match on that card that did not directly pertain to the actual tournament. I don't remember much about that specific title match because, well, there wasn't a title switch. And the Shawn Diesel split doesn't happen until like way later in '94. So that was probably just a placeholder title program to give Bret something to do while they were buying their time building up Nash. Funny too, when you go back and think about Bret's first major title defense coming out of WrestleMania 10, it's him defending against fucking Diesel, of all people. That Owen program could not come soon enough. Actually, no, I lied about that previous comment. The Diesel-Bret match was not the only match on that card that did not directly pertain to the tournament. I forgot, the Jerry Lawler-Roddy Piper match, that was not a King of the Ring match. That was just a regular singles match. And I love the idea how that whole feud is basically centered around Lawler making fun of Piper for doing charity work for the Children's Hospital in Toronto. Like, not to make light of the poor kids or anything like that. It was a weird story chain they added to this. Weirder than Roddy's promo last week in the RV, where he sat there and talked about how he doesn't take dives for anybody. Wink, wink to all the hardcores out there. So from there, we go back to the ring for a Diesel squash against Mike Moraldo, where in the first move of the match is Diesel giving Moraldo a hard shove, sending him directly on the back of his neck. They couldn't have paid me to work with this fucking guy back in the day. And aside from them mentioning here that Shawn Michaels was apparently off hanging with Sly Stallone and other random celebrities, Nash beat up the guy for a few minutes and beat him with a jackknife. Also still the current reigning Intercontinental Champion. Forgot to mention that little tidbit. It was not a particularly memorable title reign from what I remember. I would say less memorable than the random Undertaker cameo vignettes. This time, I believe it was a gas station attendant who said that he saw the Undertaker driving by on the top of a hearse not all that long ago. And for the record, no, this was not Jon Moxley. But he told us that after apparently seeing him pass by, he then vanished out of sight and was never seen again. They brought the WWF film crew to film this. Somebody thought this was a good idea. Yeah. I imagine this story went very well at parties. You know who's better at telling stories? Jerry Lawler. Particularly when he was bad-mouthing Roddy Piper like a classic Memphis heel. Regardless of whether or not the guy was lying, it is miles better than listening to random people talk about odd sightings of The Undertaker. At least Lawler knows how to act convincingly. And I hate using that word in wrestling, but it is relevant here. So anyway, he's doing the brief heat promo on Piper, saying the only reason he wears a dress was so he could avoid having to serve army duty. So when he went to take his physical, he wore a dress and high heels and got asked out by the doctor. But this was not just about Lawler's ongoing feud with Piper, because this was also a King's Court segment with special guests Nikolai Volkov and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. Well, the story only gets more fascinatingly stupid from here, so we may as well just dive headfirst into it. Not that any of it ever made sense to begin with. So DiBiase just randomly shows up this week to reiterate previous talking points about Volkov. He's broke, penniless, completely lost at sea, and now completely out of the blue, he works for DiBiase. And while Volkov may hate the $1 Million Man, thinks he's a piece of shit, the bottom line is that he needs DiBiase's money, you know, because he's broke. Therefore, it is the defenseless babyface that can't touch the heel storyline. And to further humiliate Nikolai on TV, DiBiase then presents him with a pair of trunks personalized by the $1 Million Man, saying that he is now property of DiBiase, therefore he must wear the ring trunks anytime he's out on television with him. And of course it's family first, so Nikolai obliges against his will. By the way, I have to sidetrack for a minute here. Vince and Savage were unbearably annoying during this. Like, I kept listening to them interrupting the promos in the ring, and I'm just like, would you two please shut the fuck up for like 5 minutes? God, those guys got on my nerves. But it didn't stop with the ring trunks, because then came the ring jacket. And Volkov is no longer a dual citizen of Russia and the United States. He's now permanent property of DiBiase. So he removes the jacket, and he is handed a tuxedo t-shirt. It looked as ridiculous as you would imagine. which is why it worked. And of course, the punchline to all this, after Lawler and DiBiase are hamming up like a bunch of snot-nosed punks, Lawler goes, "You know, Ted, he still doesn't look like $1 million." And DiBiase goes, "You're right. But now he's got a little bit of sense." And they both do the signature $1 million man laugh. And, well, I was not supposed to laugh, but I did. It's, it's classic heat. We've seen them do similar stuff like this in modern wrestling. Probably the most notable example being the MJF Wardlow feud from last year. You send MJF out there to intentionally humiliate Wardlow every week on TV to the point where people are just clamoring to see him rip Max's head off his shoulders. But of course, Wardlow's tied down contractually. Yeah, we remember that whole story. The one that was great until they fucked it up because it's AEW. This is a little hokier in terms of the way it's being done. It's kind of far-fetched considering that I don't think they ever fully explained why Volkov was forcibly working for DiBiase, aside from he was financially dependent on him. Like the whole thing where he talked about making bad financial investments and all that. Okay, it was kind of a half-ass explanation, but I don't know, just the way they got to this point was really fast and out of nowhere. Like, I don't even remember the last time I saw DiBiase on Raw, and then here he is just randomly showing up now associated with Nikolai Volkov for literally no reason. I don't know. It's a story that I vaguely remember around this point because it was one of the first times I ever saw Nikolai Volkov on television. And then I went back years later and saw all the Mid-South work and thought, yeah, I kind of like that version of him better. But to be fair, this was when he was on the verge of retirement, and DiBiase was obviously great. Like, him and Lawler had some really great chemistry together. I almost wish those guys would have formed a tag team at some point if DiBiase could have gotten cleared to wrestle ever again. That would have been great. But sadly, that didn't happen. But this worked for what it was designed to do. Then we had Owen Hart beating Tony Roy in a quick squash, which was mostly just a giant infomercial for Vincent Savage to plug a bunch of USA shows. There was also a Hall of Fame ceremony that Vince named early on for a bunch of legends. I have no idea where this was scheduled to take place or who was directly involved in overseeing it, but he did mention names like Bobo Brazil, Buddy Rogers, James Dudley, and a couple other pretty important names from previous generations. So, wherever this ceremony was taking place in June, must have been a pretty big deal. Beyond that, Owen won with a sharpshooter in like a minute. And then he did the classic heel bit afterwards where he put the sunglasses down on Roy's face so he could rub it in Brett's face. It's funny, too, because they did a close-up after Owen put the shades on, and they went to zoom the camera in right on Roy's face to show that he was clearly laughing. Like, he couldn't even hide it. The whole thing was so absurd. Not that heel Owen was absurd or anything. It was a hokey segment. But I talked about it before. He was so phenomenal in this role. Still the best period of Owen's career, no question. The jealous, loudmouth younger brother still trying to prove that he's better than his older brother, despite the fact that he already beat him clean on pay-per-view. Just the fact that he's not the world champion and everybody's still claiming Brett's the better man. It's not good enough for Owen, which is why the story is so legendary. You know what wasn't legendary, however? Duke the Dumpster Droese. This was about as far from legendary as one could possibly imagine. But he's still coming to the WWF. Unfortunately. And he's bringing the trashy gimmick with him. Pee-hee. But what do you say we get off that subject rather quickly and talk about the main event? Because it was... Well, it was a main event in some people's minds. I'll give it this. They certainly went out of their way to present it like a major deal. The Sumo match Showdown between Earthquake and Yokozuna with 1 week's build. I had completely forgotten this thing ever occurred, and considering all the fanfare, pomp, and circumcision that went into it, I mean, you'd have thought it would have been etched into the back of my mind, but nope, totally forgot about it. And, I watched this whole thing in full, and I really don't even know how to go about addressing it. I expected train wreck level horror. By the end, it was mid. I mean, they stalled for a few minutes and stared each other down. Vince was fapping off about the gargantuan size of both men. Rubbing one out, not even ashamed of it. They were really milking the individual lockup for all it was worth. Jim Cornette was probably standing out on the floor thinking, I'm getting paid for this right now. Can only imagine what he thought of that whole charade, if he even remembers it. And eventually they lock horns. There's a bit of a jockeying for position where both guys are trying to get the power game leverage. They spent about a minute grabbing at each other's Mawashi gimmick or whatever it's called. They're shoving each other toward the edge of the ring, and that kind of goes on for a while. Cornette's out there screaming, "Push!" to the top of his lungs. That was taken very much out of context on my end because I'm gross. And finally, Earthquake got back in control. He gave Yoko a little nudge, and Yoko took a back bump, and, well, bluntly put, he basically rolled himself out to the floor as safely as possible without hurting himself. It did not look very organic. But, of course, after Earthquake won, he got the big ovation from the crowd. Everyone's cheering him like he just beat Brett for the fucking title at WrestleMania. And that was pretty much all there was to it. And this little main event angle they shot did such a great job at putting over Earthquake as one of their top babyfaces. Approximately 1 week from this very point, Earthquake was gone from the WWF. He went over to, I believe, Japan for a brief stint. And before you know it, he wound back up in WCW a year or so later. So yeah, great feud. Nice that John Tenta was professional enough to do the job on his way out the fucking door. And, it's been years. I don't recall the logistics of what went into Earthquake abruptly leaving the company. Whether it was problems with management, contract expiration, who knows. You hear one report from wrestling sources, you're bound to get like 40 different takes from other sources. Considering he never went back to the WWF, I presume it was a fallout with Vince. And, that really sucks because they did a hell of a job putting him over here. And then immediately after this, they just move right on from it and never acknowledge the feud again. They even went so far as to promote an Earthquake King of the Ring qualifier next week. As far as I know, I don't think that match ever aired. So I don't know what happens there. Probably Owen just getting a bye or something. Yeah, it was a weird segment to recap. I didn't hate it. I wouldn't say that I was enthralled either. The whole worked sumo thing in wrestling, they did this like one other time from what I remember. I think they tried it with the Big Show one year at WrestleMania, and God, that stunk to high heaven too. This at least worked for the crowd. So, while it wasn't really for me, I can't say it was a complete and utter flop. The people enjoyed it. As did Vince. Probably a little too much. It sucks that this is what they were having poor Yoko doing around this point. Not the best usage of the guy considering how high he was on the pecking order just a few months ago, but that's Vince's booking for you. I mean, if you're into sumo fights, you definitely would want to go out of your way to check this out. But this is kind of a skippable episode beyond that. Nothing you really need to go out of your way to see. And once again, another week goes by where the WWF champion is completely absent from the show altogether. And at least he got a mention a time or two here, but yeah. What is this, like the 6th week in a row Brett has made no physical appearance? It'd be nice to maybe see him pop up in the near future, in case anybody forgot who the world champion was around this point. I mean, it's kind of important. But you know what? I will say this about Retro Raw. At least there's reliably something of note to talk about from week to week on that show. Can't say the same for SmackDown. That show is the epitome of, let me check my DVR multiple times just to make sure that I'm not accidentally watching last week's rerun. My God. Everything is so pasteurized with that show. I'm not kidding you. I've gone through like 45 minutes of watching these shows before where I actually had to stop the DVR midway through to realize, wait a second, this is last week's show I'm watching. What the fuck? I mean, it hasn't happened often. Maybe only a few times in the last 7 months. I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often. Now, I can at least say this about SmackDown from Friday night. At least they had a central theme going on. Didn't make a lick of sense, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But I'll at least give them this. The draft is over now. It would appear, at least for the time being, that the roster shakeups are actually in full effect. We had a few fresh faces on the program this week, so it's something. And the theme, for those that already didn't know, was their continuation of this ongoing tournament to crown a new World Heavyweight Champion. And there exactly lies the problem. Because if you've been paying attention to the show lately, they introduced a new world title on Raw a few weeks ago, and during that summation, Hunter basically talked about how this new World Heavyweight title is going to be a top belt on Raw. Keyword, Raw. So that begs the obvious question, why in the fuck are they also having tournament rounds for a match to determine a new world champion on Raw? On SmackDown? Does that make sense to anybody? So basically what you're telling me, if this were real, hear me out for a minute. I know I have to always preface everything I say with that comment, but I'm trying to pretend like suspension of disbelief is still a thing in wrestling. What you're telling me is that after you just did a brand split, after you just finalized a draft where you explicitly said guys will now be exclusive to their own designated rosters, now you're telling me that there's a possibility that a SmackDown exclusive talent could now not only qualify, but possibly win the Raw World Championship. So in other words, if we get down to brass tacks here, your brand split is bullshit. As we all pretty much figured it would be. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. Trying to bring some logic into a situation where there's none to be had. Even if the plan is to have Seth win the title, again, I think it's a huge mistake on their end, but even if that's the game plan, why would you be giving SmackDown guys the same opportunities if they're not active parts of Raw? Why is this tournament not exclusively happening on Raw? What does SmackDown have to do with any of this? I don't know. Because apparently the writers were too uncreative to come up with a different plot for SmackDown this week, so they all just said, let's just continue the Raw storyline on SmackDown because we're too lazy to think of anything else to do. Because that would involve work. And it sucks that I even have to bring all this up, but I mean, I can't be the only one. I didn't even talk about the stupidity of all the tournament matches being three-ways. That's just sheer idiocy in and of itself. And I'm not even trying to take away anything from the three guys that were part of the opening match here. Edge, Rey Mysterio, and AJ Styles. Those are all three great performers by their own right. I love all those guys individually for what they bring to the table as talents, but throwing them all together in a random pointless three-way with no build where two of the three guys don't even get an entrance shown? You had Edge come out there with the full entrance at the start of the show, and there's Rey and AJ standing in there jacking off with themselves like two job guys. At least they were kind enough to throw up a graphic for them both. It's funny, too, because I constantly bitch that all the ring entrances in WWE take like half an hour to get through most weeks, but they couldn't even do AJ or Rey the service of letting them come out to their own entrance. Talk about making those guys look like dorks. I mean, even if the match was AJ versus Rey or Edge versus Rey or Edge versus AJ in singles matches, would have been a hell of a lot better than just throwing them out there at the same time to do a bunch of meaningless spots for 15 minutes. Because this was not a good match. It was sloppy. It was plotting. Everybody looked like they were on different pages at random times. And it was every generic three-way you've ever seen. The other problem, too, is that you basically had three baby faces here. The crowd heavily favored Edge, but it's not like Rey or AJ were working the heel roles at any point. So really, the only thing you had to work with here was sending the guys out there to do spots. And I see that shit all the time. There's no story there. It's just guys doing choreographed moves, some of which look more egregiously cooperative than others. And that's not pro wrestling, dude. That's fucking accommodated parkour. They're doing stuff where AJ slides Rey into Edge's arms so he can catch him in a DDT position. Also, AJ can run and dropkick Edge, and then Edge accidentally DDTs Rey on the floor. I'm like, who the fuck ever came up with that spot, and why weren't they blacklisted from the wrestling business for coming up with it? By far, the most ridiculous spot was when AJ and Edge had to stand there while Rey was coming down off the top rope to set them up for duplicate Hurricane Ranas. And Edge fucked this up so bad, he actually forgot which side of the ring he was supposed to land to set up the 619. Him and AJ went in like polar opposite directions, and then Edge basically had to steer course and try to correct by bouncing off the ropes and then falling back to where AJ was. I watched it back like 5 times. I was laughing so hard. And then they both just hit Rey with a double drop kick. That also made me laugh for whatever reason. It's just, I don't know. I say it all the time, man. I hate three-ways. I fucking hate three-ways. Unless Gunther's involved with them, I have no desire to ever see another multi-man match for as long as I live. And unfortunately, I had to sit through another one on this very fucking show. More stacked up stupid plex spots, because apparently that's something we never see enough of in these multi-person matches. They always do them, because the people all go, ooh and ah. And again, going back to my conversation about these guys being on completely separate pages for a lot of the match, I have no idea what the hell happened at the finish here. Edge has AJ in the educator submission, and of course it's no rope breaks in these kinds of matches. So when AJ pulls Edge toward the ropes, Rey comes in and hits Edge with a 619, and I think the idea here was that Rey was supposed to come off the top rope and hit a seated senton on Edge, but he was supposed to counter it with a spear. Problem is, well, he didn't. Ray just sort of made contact with Edge and died, and then AJ hit Edge with a phenomenal forearm and pinned him. I don't know what the fuck happened there at the end, but clearly Edge was out to lunch on that one. Surprised too, I thought with Edge being the only guy to get an entrance, figured he was going to be the one that went over here. That's like WWE formatting 101, but now they put over AJ instead. But, eesh. Yeah, this is brutal. Gonna be honest. Not a good match at all. And like I said, all three of these guys are very good ring veterans. It's not like they don't know how to piece together a competent match, but the chemistry didn't click. So that was the first 20 minutes of the show, roughly speaking. And I already covered how none of this even made sense to begin with if we're going by the logic of them conducting a tournament for a Raw title on SmackDown. Here's a generic question. Why would any of these guys have even wanted to compete in this match? If we're judging it by the notion that all three of these guys are content wrestling on SmackDown, two of them I believe that just recently got drafted anyway, why would they have any desire to wrestle for an opportunity to go back to Raw full time? Wouldn't that just negate the contracts? Or is this just me applying too much rational thought into something that doesn't deserve any thought? Who knows? Maybe I'll just move on with the other nonsensical triple threat tournament. This one was Sheamus, Bobby Lashley, and Austin Theory. Yet again, two new names that just got drafted from Raw in the last couple weeks. Those guys being Lashley and Theory. So, of course, their very first match on SmackDown, and they both get thrown into a multi-man match. And whereas the dynamics of the first match didn't make a whole lot of sense because you had three babyfaces essentially fighting the entire time with no heels involved, this one made even less sense because you practically had one weaselly heel getting pummeled by the two stronger babyfaces and having to fend both of them off the entire match. So who was I supposed to root for? I actually felt bad for Theory here, especially when Lashley and Sheamus were ruthlessly double-teaming him for like 2 minutes straight. Like, Theory's always a good punching bag, but really wasn't a fan of that whole dynamic. I also wasn't a fan of the spot where Sheamus and Lashley were throwing weak-ass windmill punches for like a full minute. Wasn't as bad as the ones we saw with Omega and Moxley in that cage match on Wednesday where they both just outright missed each other entirely. But this was still pretty ass. And we had some more sloppy three-way spots toward the end there. Somehow Lashley got busted open hard way at one point. I have no idea how that happened. I think he may have got slammed into the ring steps at one point. But I remember Theory tried to post him at one point too, so I'm wondering if Lashley maybe overcompensated and bounced his head off the top of the LED board. Wouldn't be the first time Lashley's nearly concussed himself on that fucking ring post. But Lashley ended up trapping Theory in the Hurt Lock. Sheamus ran in and then hit Theory with a bro kick. And then Lashley dumped Sheamus out to the floor so he could get the pin on Theory. So in other words, Lashley stole his own pin. Kinda. It was a unique concept in the realm of three-ways. It wasn't him stealing another guy's pin. It was him outsmarting a dude and getting a pin after he was already in control. Or maybe I'm just overanalyzing it. In any case, that set up the main event. Not a triple threat round, thank God. But it's AJ versus Lashley in the semifinal, which, we'll cover that when we get to the main event. And again, it's not to say it was the worst three-way I've ever seen. It was better than the opener. But again, it's just guys doing spots for like 12 to 15 minutes until the other guy gets the win. It's not memorable. And you really limit yourselves in these kinds of matches because they don't normally lend themselves to anything just outside the ballpark of go out there and do a bunch of moves for a while. Three-ways are hard to do in wrestling. which is why we only used to see them in moderation over the years. When a story calls for it, they can be really great matches. When you have an established beef with three guys and you have a reason to do them, absolutely they can work. But not randomly having them on the show because you're doing a tournament, mostly consistent under triple threat rules. Again, it's just more of that lazy booking mantra we all constantly joke about. You know, the good that came out of this was that it set up a main event that we haven't seen on the show yet, taking two of your recent Raw drafts and then steamrolling them over here on SmackDown. That's good. You know, shows that the names you picked are actually worth some value. It's not shoving the same fucking three guys down our throats for the past 8 to 9 weeks in a row. So while I didn't like the concept of this tournament and the whole multi-man layout, I'll credit them for setting up a TV main event that I actually was interested in seeing. Speaking of new names that just got drafted, haven't talked about this guy in a hot minute. Grayson Waller. Yeah, I remember that guy. For the 2.5 months we actually spent watching NXT 2.0, he might have popped up a time or two. I mean, the name sounded familiar. And, well, he showed up here so he could talk with Adam Pearce. And I couldn't really figure out what was going on, but I believe he set up something for next week, saying that he wants the winner of tonight's main event on next week's show, but not in a match, but on his talk show. A talk show that I believe is called The Grayson Waller Experience. Wow. Wonder how long it took for somebody to come up with that name. The Grayson Waller Experience. Probably took the writers hours to come up with that riveting, catchy title. Because that's what this wrestling show needs more of. Talk shows. I mean, it sounds like the guy's extroverted enough to cut a halfway decent promo. I don't remember anything about Waller's work in NXT from like 2 years ago, but sounds like he can talk. It's not much of a hooking point for next week's SmackDown. Tune in to hear Grayson Waller talk. How's about I go take a solid piss? That might be more worthwhile. You know who needs their own talk show instead? In addition to receiving one of the biggest pushes on the main roster in the next year, if they're actually planning on making some fucking bank with this guy, Cameron Grimes. Fucking love this guy. God, this guy's fantastic. How in the hell it took them this long to figure out that this guy's a star in the making? Beyond me. How it took him this long to call him up to the main roster? That's another conversation entirely. The charisma this guy exudes is on a level above so many guys in this company. Natural charisma, too. The squash here with Boring Corbin was fucking perfect, dude. Couldn't have booked it better if I tried. Brief heat promo from Corbin, bell rings, cave-in foot stomp, 1, 2, 3, in and out, done. And we even got the signature, to the moon cap. And in one debut match on TV, instantly got this guy over with the crowd. And if they keep doing stuff like this with him on a regular basis, he'll stay over. Now I'm just worried they're going to try and make this an ongoing feud instead of a one-and-done blow-off. I mean, maybe if he comes out next time and beats Corbin in 5 seconds as opposed to 8. Or however long it actually went. But, yeah, this was awesome. Good shit. Best part of the show, no question. And then came time for a top-of-the-hour Bloodline promo. And, well, you know what? Before I even attempt to break any of it down, let me lay out the foundation from the beginning here. This Bloodline story has gone nowhere fast since Mania. They've hit a brick wall with the whole Sami KO versus Usos thing. I've talked about before how they either need to escalate the storyline to the next chapter or they just need to cut its knees out and move on from it. And by the time this was over, I think they may have reinvigorated my interest. The jury's still out on it, but there's a chance that they may have saved it. Possibly. Now, as far as the actual segment itself, first of all, allow me to get my biggest criticism out of the way first. Fuck, this went on forever. I mean, I'm usually not one to get bogged down with long promo segments. Normally, I'm okay with the elongated, stretched out promo, provided it's warranted. Gotta be honest, dude. This was starting to reach like peak Hunter promos from the early 2000s level of get on with it and get to the fucking point. Roman's out there talking, and he's talking, and he's talking, and he's talking, and he's talking some more. He's talking about how the Bloodline was the first group in wrestling to main event both nights of WrestleMania back-to-back, putting over how Solo Sikoa stepped up at Backlash when their backs were against the wall, talking about how they don't have a Matt Riddle or a Sami and KO problem anymore. Now they have an Usos problem. And then Roman goes over and starts berating Jimmy and Jay, telling them to apologize for letting the tribal chief down, not once but twice, saying they had no business dedicating a tag title match to Roman when he's not even part of a tag team. I'm sitting there like, is there going to be a point to this? Because I'm starting to get a little fatigued now. I did write this down too. Funny how when Roman was there talking about Sami and Owens being in their past, who was the crowd chanting for? Sami. Not Owens. Just Sami. Oh, that poor bastard. Kevin Owens. Living in Sami's shadow like always. And I'm sure that'll be their rationale for when Owens turns on Sami for the 83rd time in the last 10 years. That'll be the caveat right there. But getting back to this, finally Roman pie faces Jimmy. And they've obviously been teasing the split with these guys for a while, so the fans were definitely popping to see Jimmy fire back and punch Roman in the face. But of course, Jay steps in and says they're both sorry. And if Roman gives them one more chance, they'll make sure they bring the gold back home to the Bloodline. And that's when the segment turned around a little bit. Because I actually kind of like the idea of the swerve here. Roman tells Paul to deliver the message. Like the fucking great toady Paul E is, he hobbles himself over to Roman and politely asks for the microphone. He's so great in this role. Can't say enough good things about Heyman. But he tells everybody that after meeting with the WWE Board of Directors, they have officially sanctioned a tag team title match at the Night of Champions live special. For the undisputed tag belts, it will be Sami and Owens defending against the Bloodline team of Solo Sikoa and Roman Reigns. And that's when I perked up and said, oh, okay. It's a little out of left field, but, you know, I don't entirely hate the idea of that. I think it's going to evidently piss off the Sami Kevin Owens fans, but, well, let's just call it like it is. You're not going to do a title match like that unless you plan on doing a title swap. If you're booking Roman and Sikoa versus Owens and Zayn for the tag belts, you don't do that match unless you plan on switching the belts over to Roman and Solo. The only way out of that scenario is maybe you have Jimmy and Jay screw over Roman and Sikoa. And while that could work in theory, I don't see them putting Roman in a vulnerable situation like that. Certainly not a throwaway premium live special. And they've been overly protective of Sikoa too. I can't imagine they wind up beating either of them. So I think they're going to have Owens and Zayn drop the straps. Which, honestly, now that we've kind of seen the follow-up with their title reign after Mania, starting to think it might not be a bad idea. And there's more to milk with the story of Solo and Roman as the tag champs than there is having Sami and Owen basically do jack all of nothing with them over on Raw. Because let's think about it from this standpoint too. What compelling tag title feuds can you really do with those guys? At least you have the built-in storyline of Roman and Solo carrying the tag straps on SmackDown while the Usos are hanging out with their dicks in their hand, buying their time waiting to fuck over their teammates. There's ways you could go with that. I really like the idea of Sikoa and Roman as the tag champs. It's a natural fit. You have more layered stories of assorted directions you can take the Bloodline story from there. I mean, if you're going to drag this thing out, you got to take it somewhere. It might be worth trying. You know, even the little pot shot at the end here where Roman promised that he was going to dedicate the match to the greatest tag team of all time. And then he paused to look over his shoulder at his brothers, and then he looks and goes, Alpha and Sika, the Wild Samoans. Just a subtle little dig at Jimmy and Jay there before they all left. Again, I'm not opposed to them doing a rapid-fire title switch like that. It's not to say they have to, but I just don't understand why you would book a match like this unless the plan was to have Roman and Sikoa win the belts. But they had me hooked with this one. I'll admit that. I wasn't digging the Bloodline stuff with everything they did post-Mania. Now they've sort of gained my attention again. So I'll take it. So following that, we had this Bayley Dakota Kai versus Liv Morgan Raquel Demetri as a title match. And I had some time I needed to make up for this thing, so I exercised my fast-forward leverage. I wrote down the following bullet points. Damage control is still a thing, Liv Morgan is still a thing, and apparently the women's tag belts are still a thing. Meanwhile, I was sitting there trying to make sense out of this new team that they called up from NXT. So I will take this opportunity to just throw the question out there in the open. What the fuck is a Pretty Deadly? And who thought that would be a clever name for a tag team? If they were not immediately fired from the creative team after they suggested that, I hope someone at least considered it. Hopefully they were put on a heavy probation. Good Lord, what a stupid team name. And what were their names? Did I hear that the blonde one was Elton Prince? And the brunette is Kit Wilson? Elton Prince and Kit Wilson. Mid-card purgatory. That was the first thing I thought of, dude. Career's doomed. You come out of the creative meeting and that is what you suggest for two guys in terms of their ring names, Elton Prince and Kit Wilson. Goodbye. Best of luck to your future endeavors. Much less the name Pretty Deadly. You may as well have just called them the Suspect Sissies. What the fuck were those outfits? Billy and Chuck wore less effeminate attire than that. let's just hope to God they can wrestle. Because if this gimmick is what I think it is, I don't know how long I'll be wanting to stick around to watch it. Speaking of things we didn't need to stick around all that long for, up next we had a Bianca Belair Championship celebration. Keep in mind, again, she is the current reigning Raw Women's Champion. And she has now been drafted to SmackDown. So instead of, I don't know, stripping her of the Raw title because she's no longer associated with the brand, well, now she still has it. And I guess we're all just supposed to look past it like it doesn't matter. And here's pretty much everything that happened here. Bianca came out skipping and smiling, twirling her hair the whole 9 yards. They blew off some pyro for her when she came down to the ring. They had the balloons and the confetti going. And then Asuka interrupted. It was clear as day she had a gimmick in her mouth because her cheeks were all puffed out when she was coming down the rampway. And they both got in the ring. Asuka went to extend her hand to Bianca. They shook. And then Asuka spit green mist at Bianca's face, and then she left. That was it. And I mean, granted, they didn't gloss right over it. Bianca sold it well. It was hilarious watching the geeks come down with water bottles and towels to try and wipe off Bianca's face, but then they all just stood there while Bianca was screaming and pushed them all away. I don't think that was the intent, but I mean, I laughed because the whole thing was so absurd. And I mean, I wish I could provide more input, but I got nothing. Of course, it was Bianca's hometown, so Vince was probably sitting back there like, I've got an idea. Let's have Asuka humiliate Bianca in her hometown. That'll make the people happy. That's such good shit. Whatever. And by the way, I'm not trying to relive the past or anything, but didn't Asuka just lose clean to Bianca at WrestleMania? Or did I dream that happened? Why would I care about the rematch? Is it going to be a blindfold match now? That would actually be mildly entertaining now that I think of it. Maybe if they had Jake Roberts agenting the match, they could make it work. But, I mean, it was kind of dumb. At least it was short. Hopefully they flushed Bianca's eyes before the night was over. Took her off to a local medical facility. Oh, in any case, that brought us to the main event. AJ Styles versus Bobby Lashley, with the winner advancing to the Night of Champions show to wrestle in the finals for the World Heavyweight Championship. God, what a fucking lump Lashley had on the top of his head. Did you all catch that? That was quite the stinger. And look, I will say this. I credit both guys for pulling double duty. AJ and Bobby, those guys aren't young dudes anymore, so it was probably challenging for them to both work full-length matches on the same night like they did here. So good for them. Conditioning and cardio is key to making something like that work, and I thought they did a fine job. The match did what it needed to. I think they put the right guy over, too. You know, AJ versus Rollins is a lot more appealing on paper than Lashley versus Rollins. Again, it's still dumb to have a Raw versus SmackDown match on pay-per-view when they literally just got done cementing the brand split. But, I mean, I think the odds of AJ winning that match are slim to none anyway. The match here was okay. Both guys were clearly blown up by the end of it. Lashley's cut opened up again on him too, so he was a little wobbly there in the last couple minutes. They had Lashley post himself in the corner, and then AJ hit the springboard forearm for the 3 count. Interesting to see Lashley get beat clean, but I mean, when you're essentially doing babyface versus babyface, you're going to run into those problems. And while it's still dumb because Seth versus AJ is face versus face, now you know what? Fuck it. If I buried everything WWE did, I'd be doing 8-hour podcasts every week talking about how they could have done it better. But I'll say this. They're really stacking the card for the Saudi show. You got Seth and AJ in the title match. Cody versus Brock, round 2 is coming up there. You got the Solo and Roman versus Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn match for the tag titles. It's a pretty loaded card. We'll probably have Asuka and Bianca on that show too. And I mean, that was a good match at WrestleMania. Not as good as the Io Bianca match from the Backlash show, but I don't know. We all know WWE likes to go big with the stadium shows. They're definitely not phoning it in with this one. And, you know, while I wasn't a fan of everything they did on SmackDown, there was some decent stuff going on here. Looked like actual effort was being put into the show, and I haven't been able to say that for a lot of the SmackDowns we've talked about in the last 7 months. If you remove any form of coherency to the booking of the tournament, the end result was at least good. Granted, I'm not looking forward to hearing a bunch of Saudis go, oh, for like 10 minutes. But that's why I'm thanking God that Seth is on Raw and not SmackDown every week. Still no sign of Bray Wyatt, which has also been a blessing in disguise. I did wonder, though, where was LA Knight? Just throwing it out there. I mean, as far as I know, he's still on SmackDown. And he got a TV win a couple weeks ago. Good follow-up. But we'll see what they do. So that'll wrap up this show this week. We'll be back on Friday for, obviously, the Dynamite review and the 2 retro reviews. That show on Friday, looking ahead, might be a little shorter as well because both the Crockett Show and the World Class shows are shorter episodes. So we might actually be able to fire through that one in about an hour or so, depending on how long I want to rant and rave about AEW again. But we'll catch you all on the flip side. Thanks for watching and tuning in, and have a good week. Peace out.